civil rights that have been allotted to members of the LGBT community has been an ongoing and uphill battle for the better part of 70 years. Are you, or maybe someone you know, part of this community? If you are, or if you know someone who is, then understanding their history and understanding their struggles throughout history in America is really important. Today I'm going to tell you about some of the key points throughout these movements and some of the struggles that they faced in American history, including the arrest of up to 1 million individuals during the 1940s through the 60s, the Lavender Scare and the related Eisenhower Executive Order 10450, and a section of the Affordable Care Act known as Section 1557. So, according to Jason M. Shepard, in his paper, The First Amendment and the Roots of LGBT Rights Law, Censorship in the Early Homophile Era, 1958 through 1962, he discusses how during the 1940s through the 60s, the government launched a sort of campaign to erase homosexuality from the nation. Now, before this point, homosexuality was seen as taboo, and there were laws against sodomy, but there weren't laws strictly against being like a homosexual. Sexual orientation wasn't really a political thing at this point. But then during the 40s and 60s, they launched a full-on campaign. Shepard discusses the increase in laws that actually did go against that community, that relations, everything like that. And the criminal sentences for these crimes were also expanded. So the punishments were very severe, and being outed during this time period could genuinely be life-ruining. There was no protection from discrimination in your workplace, so if you were outed, you were more than likely going to lose your job and probably a lot of people in your life. It was a really bad time period for this community. Arrest records from this time period show that about 1 million people were arrested and penalized, not just arrested, but penalized, charged, served punishments for being involved in some sort of homosexual act, such as dancing, kissing, touching, and of course homosexual sex. Shepard also discussed how the cops would lock down on the homosexual hangouts, bars and clubs that were frequented by this community. They would stage raids, and they would funnel funds into the raids and the stings on people who were suspected of this type of behavior so that they could be caught in the act. A lot of arrests were made. They were really cracking down on this community because the government wanted to wipe them out. They didn't want this in there. Now that I've explained the rise of sexual orientation in politics and the crackdown of the law, I'm going to tell you about the Lavender Scare and the related Eisenhower Executive Order 10450. So when discussing all of these arrests that were made, I did discuss how there was discrimination was allowed in the workplace, and it was a big fear of everybody who was involved in this community, and that's why they were so afraid of being outed. So I'm going to talk about this paper, The Endurance Test, Executive Powers and the Civil Rights of LGBT Americans. This is by Matthew S. Nosenchuk, and he discusses the Lavender Scare and Eisenhower's Executive Order 10450. Now, the Lavender Scare, and we can kind of see, this is a picture of some of the protesters. I got this from Variety. This is just a picture of some of the protesters. But basically, the Lavender Scare was when the government went on this big firing spree. And they just started firing a bunch of people who had been suspected of any kind of same-sex relations, anybody who was expected of being part of the LGBT community. They didn't want them holding government positions. It wasn't against the law at this point for them to hold those positions, but they just thought it had been stated that one Senate report from 1950 described how one homosexual could pollute an entire government office with their weak moral fibers and their emotional instability. Now, then Nosenchuk also goes on to describe Executive Order 10450, and this is a newspaper clipping from around that time period as well, and it just talks about what's going on with all of the LGBT members, and you can see that they're being referred to as perverts. The reason they're being referred to as that is because in Eisenhower's Executive Order 10450, there is a section that said that government officials cannot be working for the government if they hold ideologies or if they participate in acts that are seen as not aligning with the best interest of national security. One of those things that would qualify somebody to be fired from the government and not be allowed to hold a government position was sexual perversion. Sexual perversion also included homosexuals or same-sex activities. So Eisenhower's executive order actually banned homosexuals from holding any kind of government position. He stated that the government employees had to be investigated, and if their beliefs or their acts didn't line up with those interests of national security, they were going to be let go. Now that I've talked about the Lavender Scare and Eisenhower Executive Order 10450, I'm going to tell you about the Affordable Cares Act, Section 1557. Now this one is much more recent, and my source for this one is this paper, which is by Sarah Clemens, and it's called A Band-Aid Fix, Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act and the Need for Federal Laws to Protect Transgender People in Healthcare. Now, the Affordable Cares Act was passed during Obama's presidency, and the goal for it was to make healthcare more affordable and more accessible for everybody in America. Now, Section 1557 is a specific section that says that you cannot discriminate against patients in healthcare providers and health insurances cannot discriminate against patients based on their sex, race, or national origin. So, the Affordable Cares Act was passed during Obama's time, which I said, by his team. And this portion of it banned the discrimination against sex. Well, what they did is they worked with the Office of Civil Rights to make clarifications that said that sex, when discussing discrimination, also is going to include gender identity, or how someone identifies, and it's also going to include like sex stereotyping. That's not allowed either. So this played a big role in protecting transgender and gender non-conforming from discrimination in healthcare. So in 2016 and again in 2020, the definition of sex when discussing discrimination was challenged. In 2016, religious healthcare providers and 8 states wanted to change the definition to only include the binary biological sexes. Now, there was a district court judge who agreed with them and said that Section 1557 was kind of overstepping its boundaries by making the definition include more than just the binary sexes, but nothing really came of effect until 2020 during Trump's presidency. So in June of 2020, Trump's Department of Health and Human Services repealed Obama's passing of this act, or this section, and they rewrote it so that the new definition of sex discrimination only included the binary sexes for protection against discrimination. So with doing this, they took away the fact that transgender people or gender non-conforming people, those members of the LGBT community, had a protection against discrimination in healthcare. So that's a more recent act of a struggle that the LGBT community may have faced. So I didn't include all of the important aspects or all of the important moments throughout the civil rights movement, or even all of the struggles that the LGBT community have faced, but I did bring up a general debriefing and some important moments in understanding the struggles of LGBT throughout American history. Again, I discussed the smackdown of the law during the 1940s through the 60s and the arrest of up to 1 million people. I discussed the Lavender Scare and the Eisenhower Executive Order 10450, and I also discussed the Affordable Cares Act, Section 1557, which was a much more recent issue. So I hope you enjoyed learning about some of the struggles and the processes that the LGBT community have gone through throughout American history. Their rights have improved, but there's definitely still hardships even today. Thank you.